rather miss a few things here and there than to rush through the whole thing and not get anything out of it. That's kind of been my philosophy in teaching classes like this. So what did we do last week? We introduced the book. And after that address of the book, verses 1 and 2 of Philippians 1, we got into the first major theme of the letter to the Philippians. We're just outlining this according to the major themes. And the first major theme of the book of Philippians are the Philippians themselves, the people. And we learn about them through a prayer that's recorded in verses 3 through 11. We covered most of the prayer, and it's typical of many of the prayers that begin Paul's epistles. There's thanksgiving for all his remembrance of them. He is thankful in particular for their partnership in the gospel with him. And we talked a little bit about how that obviously entailed some financial support. He mentions it at length in chapter 4, but also sharing with him in his conflict, standing with him through his imprisonment and trial, and not abandoning him in his time of need. Remember, this is a prison epistle, and he's writing this from a Roman prison cell, and you'll see that reflected in the material we're covering tonight as well. As he finishes the prayer, he prays that they will grow in love, if you look at verse 9, in knowledge and discernment. And that prayer will yield big results as they are able to approve what is excellent and to be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, and also filled with the fruit of righteousness. And that ends the section I wanted to cover last week. It's just this prayer that tells us a lot of information about the Philippians themselves. Now, we break there and go to the second great theme of the book of Philippians. It's going to take us 2 weeks to cover this theme, and that is the imprisonment of Paul. It's a prison epistle. He tells us a great deal about what it's like to be in chains, but it's more about what it's like for Paul to be in chains. It's probably not the attitude most of us would have if we were in a similar situation. Maybe it would be. If you have the same spirit and faith in Christ that Paul does, then maybe you would sound this positive and upbeat in this situation. But I think Paul is pretty unusual here, and you are familiar with this territory, I'm sure. If not, you'll see what I'm talking about. And if you are familiar with it, hopefully we can hit some things as we go deep into this that you've never thought about before. And first, we're going to see here 3 tools that serve to advance the gospel, as he puts it, while imprisoned in Rome. Now, that phrase comes from verse 12, where he says, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. What happened to him? Well, there's a lot to go into that, and I think we should give a little background before we go beyond verse 12 in this. He had made plans to go to Rome as a free man. He opens his letter to the Romans, in Romans chapter 1, saying that he had never been there before and he'd like to visit Rome, and he talks about his itinerary at the end of that letter. If I can get you to, let's just turn over to Romans chapter 15 and see him making plans to visit Rome, not knowing that he would get there eventually in chains. I'll start reading. This is like the book of Philippians, a letter, and it ends with just some list of plans and greetings and those kinds of things as he closes the letter out. And he's doing that in verse 24 of Romans chapter 15. I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain. Now, if you can draw a map in your head really quickly, you know, Rome is in Italy and it's west of Jerusalem, and then Spain is a lot farther west than that. In fact, it would probably have been the farthest west the gospel would have reached up to that point. So Paul is thinking, where better to make a pit stop on my way to Spain than Rome? Kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Number one, I can meet these brethren in person that are so special to me. And number two, maybe they can help finance my mission trip to Spain. This might have been the fourth missionary journey. Of course, you know his plans were interrupted. So he goes on to say, and to be helped on my journey there by you, once I've enjoyed your company for a while. At present, however, I'm going to Jerusalem bringing aid to the saints. And then he mentions the Philippians in the next verse, which is kind of interesting. From Macedonia, now Macedonia would be the province in which Philippi is located, Philippi being the chief city there, and also Thessalonica. Those are two churches that were located there. And then Achaia. Achaia is, anybody know what church was in Achaia? Corinth. So we're talking about churches all on that Greek peninsula, Corinth being in the south, Macedonia being up in the north. Those churches on that Greek peninsula have been pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints in Jerusalem. And he goes on to talk more about that contribution, but he's been taking up a collection for humanitarian aid in Jerusalem because there's extreme poverty there. A lot of people are going hungry, namely the saints. And so he's got to take that collection that he's now gathered together down to Jerusalem and deliver it to the people who need it before he's able to make his trip to Rome and then to Spain. All of this comes, I think, with an understood Lord willing. I think Paul knows those plans could be interrupted. He knows how fragile his position is in Jerusalem. And in Acts chapter 21 and following, you can read about how he did make it to Jerusalem, but while he was there, he was arrested on some trumped-up charges about how he's against the Jewish people and against the temple and against the nation of the Jews. And he's put in prison. Of course, the people who are over him are not Jews, they're Romans, and they don't understand this thing going on between Paul and the Jews, so they just leave him in prison. And he's in prison through one proconsular, and then through another proconsular. And finally, when he sees this is going nowhere, and he's been in that situation for 2 years or more, he appeals to Caesar, which is something that Paul can do as a Roman citizen. He makes his appeal to Caesar, which means they have to bring him bound in chains across the ocean to the Italian peninsula to face Nero himself. And so that's how he got to Rome. And it's really quite touching when you read about how he finally met the Romans that he had pictured in his mind for so long. This is in Acts chapter 27, where in verse 11 Luke writes about this. It says, after 3 months we set sail on a ship that had wintered on the island, a ship of Alexandria with the twin gods as a figurehead. And he goes on to talk about some more in this travelogue. And then verse 14 he says, we found brothers, Christians, and were invited to stay with him for 7 days, and so we came to Rome. And the brothers there, the brothers from Rome, the ones to whom he was writing in the letter we read just a moment ago, when they heard about us, came as far as the Forum of Appius and 3 taverns to meet us. And on seeing them, Paul thanked God and took courage. And when we came into Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldier that guarded him, which gives you the occasion of the writing of the book of Philippians. You might be saying, why isn't he reading about Philippi? Because Paul is writing from Rome. And you know, he had planned to go there on his own volition, but he came in chains. And he had planned this for so long, and he'd been through a shipwreck. And it's just really touching to me to read the way Luke writes it, that on seeing them, the Romans, he thanked God and took courage. It's just, there's something to that really touches me. And that brings us to Rome. That's the situation he's in. He's under house arrest. He has to furnish his own expenses. And as Luke mentions here, he is always with a soldier that guarded him. Now that brings us to Philippians chapter 1, where he tells us more about his imprisonment. And he tells us that God gave him 3 tools that turned this imprisonment into a situation that actually served to advance the gospel, not the other way around. We would think you put the greatest evangelist in prison, it's going to stop the gospel in its tracks. That's not what happens. God gives him 3 opportunities, even in prison, that allows the gospel to continue to progress and move forward. And so the first one is his chains. Verses 12 through 14. Let's read that together. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. So his chains are one of the very things that gives him the opportunity to advance the gospel in this new area of Rome. Now, he mentions, my translation has it, the imperial guard. We talked a little about that. That has reference to the soldier that he's chained to. Now, there are some translations that seem to indicate a place, the praetorium. And the original wording here is praetorion, which did originally have to do with a Roman prison camp and later the headquarters of a governor. But it's also a word by Paul's day that was used to refer to soldiers themselves, an elite group of soldiers that were the personal bodyguards of the emperor himself. There were 10,000 of these guys that were handpicked by the emperor and his generals, and they were on the same rank and level as the centurions. Centurions were really important soldiers. You may know about them through the Bible stories. They were captains over 100 soldiers. Now, these weren't centurions, but what I'm saying is they were on the same rank and level as a centurion. And they usually served for 12 to 16 years, and then they could retire. And the reason they had that short of an office or term, is the word I'm looking for, is because a lot of them didn't live out that long, and also at a certain age, they just weren't physically able to do this job anymore. If they reached retirement, they got a very nice grant. They would usually get land, plenty of money to live off of. They were highly respected, very disciplined men, these imperial guardsmen. And so that is who's watching Paul. Now you see that and you think, why all of this attention to Paul? These men were on 6-hour shifts. And so 4 of them per day were spent on Paul. And like I said, he was literally chained to them. Why so much attention to Paul? Was he a terrorist? Were they afraid this little scholar was going to go out and kill people or escape from prison? That's not what it was. Does anybody have any idea why these guys were watching Paul so closely? He was continuously teaching, but the Romans didn't care about that. They were okay with him teaching as long as they knew where he was. Now the Jews, that's a different story. They didn't want him teaching. But, obviously he's getting these letters out and he's seeing guests. You read at the end of the book of Acts. So he has some freedom to teach and meet with people. Timothy is with him here. Any other ideas? Well, maybe it's possible that they heard some of the stories about, Peter and Paul himself in Philippi escaping from prison. That's possible. Yeah, that's what I was getting at. It was not so much for the Romans' protection as it was for Paul's protection. They didn't want this very important, prominent, high-profile leader of the Christian church hurt, killed, kidnapped under their watch. So they put this elite bodyguard with him at all times, and that's why he made it to trial. Otherwise, I think he would have probably been killed. If somebody could have gotten a hold of him in Rome, they would have. He had a lot of enemies. And this is just, guessing, but that makes a lot more sense than being afraid that Paul was like, James Bond or something, that escape out. Although Jim makes a good point that several apostles had escaped from prison in the past because of the miraculous intervention of God. And maybe those stories had gotten to Rome and convince the Romans that he needed that. But that was having an effect because he was with 4 different guards a day. And he says here that his imprisonment for Christ has become known throughout the whole imperial guard. I don't know if he had the same 4 every day, probably not. There was probably multiple soldiers assigned to him personally, and then you could think, would become so fascinated with him that they go back to the bunkhouse or wherever they spend the night and tell the others about this guy that they'd been appointed to and how interesting he was and what he was saying and how everything that they had done, that all the sins that they had committed could be washed away by this Jesus of Nazareth from Galilee. And it got some attention. So you see his chains working their effect on the guards, but not only the guards, but the local church there in Rome as well. Because he goes on to say in verse 14 that most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. They were afraid before Paul came as a prisoner, but his example was so inspiring to them that they became bolder and they were filled with courage because of how he inspired them. It's so important that we conduct ourselves with dignity and faith, no matter what we're going through, because people are always watching to see, is this guy's faith for real, or is it all just an act? Is he going to be into God? Is he going to believe in God only when things are good? It's the challenge Satan gave Job early in human history. Does Job serve you for nothing? And these brethren believed in God, but they were watching Paul. Just think of the damage Paul could have done if he had been cowardly and unfaithful and disbelieving in this situation. So his chains was the first of 3 tools that served to advance the gospel. It's amazing how God can use things like that in our lives. Anybody want to make another comment on that before we move on to some more material in chapter 1? Yeah. I really think his hand is all through this. Maybe God knew that Paul could reach far more people in this situation than in his customary way. Yeah. Okay, let's look at the second tool. Okay, the second tool, and again, this is not what you would expect, but the second tool is Paul's critics. The first tool was his chains. The second tool, his critics. Let's look at verses 15 through 18. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of rivalry, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. That's interesting. People preaching out of rivalry. What does that mean? What's rivalry? Competition. They're competing with Paul. Paul didn't even enter this competition, and he finds himself a part of it when he's behind bars. And they really want to take advantage of this because he's behind bars now. They can get one up on him, right? And now, what was the motive? Some people might automatically jump to the idea that it was false teaching. They wanted to preach out of rivalry, and their motive was to get some contrary doctrines to what Paul had been preaching out there. Is that what's going on here? What do you think? Yeah, it's not false doctrine, because if you look again at verse 18, Paul says, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice.
It's probably just the same kind of thing that caused Ananias and Sapphira to do what they did. It was just the love of this, the adoration of others. They saw how people were treating Barnabas, and they wanted to be done that way, and they gave up a lot to be put in that position.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. I hadn't thought about Ananias and Sapphira, but they are a great example of what these men are doing. They were competing with Barnabas to get the accolades, and these men seem to be in it for that. Some have wondered, was there a money motive here? Paul obviously was not making a whole lot of money, although you could make money preaching in those days as you can now. Paul does make an interesting comment in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 17, where he calls some of his rivals peddlers of the gospel. So they were in it for the money. And then you also have that line about elders, in the qualifications for elders in 1 Timothy chapter 3, that they don't need to be greedy for filthy gain. So there was a way to make evidently a significant amount of money, but that to me doesn't seem to be the motive here. I think Tim is right on the money here where he says it's all about, pride and wanting prominence and recognition, making a name for themselves. And I'm going to tell on my own kind here for just a minute, but preachers can really get taken away by that kind of thing, okay? And today it's worse than ever. The internet makes everything worse. So it does that temptation of wanting to be the center of attention, wanting to be promoting yourself. And now you can do that not just in your church building or on lectureship programs and gospel meetings, but now you can toot your horn all over the World Wide Web. And it's a real temptation that preachers have to watch out for because the job is to stand up like I am here and everybody's looking at you. And for some people that's terrifying, but when you get used to the idea, it can be a dangerous temptation to get taken away with that and start thinking, well, this is all about me. And it's not. It should never be about the preacher, right? It's always about Christ and exalting Him. But far too many make it about themselves. So we can look through our own lens of our own culture and see what's going on here. It's not hard to believe this kind of thing would happen. People were jealous of the attention Paul was getting. And Paul, while he was getting the most attention, that was not his motive. That's the irony. He was in it for Christ, and he was getting the attention, and the men who were in it for the attention, well, they weren't getting the attention they had hoped they would receive. There's another interesting term he gives them later on in 2 Corinthians in chapter 11, verse 5. He sarcastically calls them super apostles. He says, I am not the least inferior of the super apostles. I had somebody one time, I'd written an article and it had a little sarcasm in it, and they accused me of doing something wrong by using sarcasm. And I asked them if they'd ever read Isaiah or Jeremiah or Paul, because and they thought I was being sarcastic when I said that. But I was actually, trying to make a point that they use that all the time. And Paul, referring to these guys in 2 Corinthians, was a lot more sarcastic than he is here. Here his attitude is just unbelievable. He has to be the least insecure preacher, church leader I've ever seen in my life. Because what does he say about them? As long as they're preaching the truth, God be praised. He's not worried about it. Let them win. Let them get the attention. As long as they're proclaiming Christ, I rejoice. I rejoice in them, the rivals, the conceited ones. It's a great example.
Acts 14:15, where they come into the city and they're calling Zeus and all this,
Oh, yeah.
and so forth, and they're saying, no, we are just simple men, just like you.
That example shows Paul's humility there, and Barnabas, when they wanted to worship them as gods. If you're working miracles in pagan areas or anywhere, you have ample opportunity to make yourself into a god. But they wouldn't do it. So just an admirable quality here. You can't be a great leader and be insecure. You just can't. It might work for a little while, but you're going to have people who attack you. You're going to have critics. You're going to lose some battles. And humility is what carries you through. We talked about perseverance last quarter. Humility is key to perseverance. And so Paul, I would imagine, even though he was in prison, was preaching long after these rivals had quit and gone on to do something else they thought might get them even more attention. We're going to move on to the next tool, unless somebody has another comment they want to make about these guys preaching out of rivalry. All right, let's go to the third tool. Third tool is Paul's crisis. Okay, so this is verses 19 and following, and let's just read those verses together. He says, "Yes, and I will rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance. As it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me, yet which I shall choose I cannot tell. I'm hard-pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith, so that in me you may have ample cause to glory in Christ Jesus because of my coming to you again." So the question here that's on everybody's mind, he's talking about life or death. What did he expect would happen? And in several places, he reveals his expectation to be released from prison. Starting in verse 19, if you want to go back over it, "I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance." And then he says it again in verse 25, where he says he's convinced. He says, "I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith." And there are indications elsewhere in the letter, such as in chapter 2, verse 24, where he says, "I trust in the Lord that shortly I myself will come also." And then there's one other interesting note I'll bring to your attention from the letter to Philemon. Philemon's one of the 4 prison epistles, so it's written in the same condition. He basically tells Philemon to get the guest room ready for him. At the same time, prepare a guest room for me, for I'm hoping that through your prayers I will be graciously given to you. Interesting how he puts that. He doesn't believe that it's in his hands, but in the hands of the Lord, who will, by grace, release him from prison for the sake of the work that he can do for the kingdom. That's his expectation, but it's more of a guess than anything. He hasn't been told that. That hasn't been miraculously revealed to him. It just, the best he can figure, he's going to be released and be able to continue preaching uninhibited in other places. But then he has this firm expectation of something else. Look at verse 20 again, back in Philippians chapter 1. Here's his firm expectation. This is what he knows for sure. He says, "As it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death." So what is he saying there? He's saying, I don't know for certain whether I will live or die. I think I will live through this. But I do know this for certain. Whether I live or die, Christ will be honored in my body. I have full courage and I will not be at all ashamed. But I will die. If I die, I will die with dignity. If I will live with honor. Now, the word he uses to describe that expectation and hope is an interesting word, translated eager expectation here. In other places, it's translated differently. In Luke chapter 21, verse 28, Jesus is talking about the coming destruction on the city of Jerusalem, and he says, "You will look with raised heads," or uplifted heads. You kind of get the picture of that. You're anticipating it, you see it coming over the horizon, and you look and you see it. And another place where that word is used is in Romans chapter 8, verse 19, where Paul is talking about how the whole creation groans, waiting for the redemption of our bodies, the coming of the Son of Man. He says, using the same terminology, it's translated in the sense of the creation watching with outstretched neck. You know, it's almost like the uplifted head. You're just, you know it's coming. You wouldn't do that. You wouldn't stretch your neck out and look using all the height that you can muster unless you really expected to see something as a result. And that's the wording that he's using here in verse 20 of Philippians chapter 1. He's got this earnest expectation, this uplifted head, this outstretched neck as he's peering just over the horizon, and he can see the dust being unsettled, and he knows this is coming. And what is it that he sees coming? He's not going to be ashamed, and he's going to be honored. He's going to honor Christ, and he can't quite see if that is in life or in death, but he can see that much. And it's, again, very interesting to contrast his concern and his hope with what ours might be in that situation. Because we'd be like, okay, it's great to be honored, but am I going to die? You know, that's what we would be. But he's fine not knowing as long as he knows he won't bring shame on the Lord, and he will be able to honor Christ through this situation. Just fascinating to see that go on. Now, let's talk about this life or death situation. This is the part of the letter that's brought up a lot of times at funerals. He's not afraid of life or death. He's not longing to die in prison. Some people might say there's some things worse than death, and I'd like this to just end right here. He's not doing that, and he's not terrified of death either. He says, in fact, he uses this phrase, he's hard pressed between the two. Not sure which one would be better, life or death. And so here's how he weighs it. He says, to remain alive would be better for the believers in Philippi and for the furtherance of the gospel. That goes back to verse 12, where he says that all these things have served to advance the gospel. That word advance or furtherance in the King James has to do with blazing a trail, kind of like being a pioneer. And so he's going into new territories, blazing new territory through this imprisonment. Nobody had ever been through this in Rome before. Nobody had penetrated into the imperial guard. You know, that's just one example. Paul was going into, this is what excited Paul, to lay new foundations. And it excited him about that. And also he's excited to think about the growth that would occur among the Philippians if he lived through this. Verse 25, convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith. The word progress there, same word translated advance in verse 12. Not only would he see new territory in the mission field and the imperial guard, etc., but he would see new growth in the people who are already Christians over in Macedonia, among the churches at Philippi and Thessalonica and in the church in Corinth and the church there in Rome. And we got to think about growth in both those places. Some churches concentrate on one and some on the other, but we need to think about growth in both those places. New territory in spreading the gospel to new converts, and new territory in the growth in our own lives. It doesn't matter if you've been a Christian for 2 years or 60 years. It doesn't matter. You can break through new territory in your faith. And he's excited about that too. That's on the living side of things. But also he said to die was gain for him. Because it meant two things if you look at verse 23. My desire, number one, is to depart. And the verb for depart is what he uses for his death. And depart is not a word that you would use for somebody who's going to disappear or be annihilated or completely made extinct or terminated, right? Depart is going away from one place into another place. It's about a journey. And so Paul's mind, death is a journey. It's not the end at all. And this word is used in different contexts. It was used by soldiers, and it meant to take your tent down and move on. Paul was a tent maker. So maybe that's the background of the word for him. Maybe that's kind of the connotation with it. And he does use the word tent with regard to his body in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, and how that tent would be removed and how he would have a new body. But it was also a political term describing the setting free of a prisoner. And he might have been thinking about how he was imprisoned in a body that was constantly, well, it was starting to betray him. It bore the marks of Christ Jesus, he said at the end of the letter to the Galatians. It was beaten and bruised. He was facing his own mortality all of the time, hungry a lot, hurting a lot. Maybe that's what he was thinking of. It was also used in another context by farmers to mean unyoking the oxen. Paul carried a big burden on his shoulders, didn't he? It was hard to be an apostle. And death also sets the saint free from those burdens. Blessed are the dead that die in the Lord from henceforth. Blessed indeed, saith the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors and that their deeds follow them. And so that too may have been on his mind. Maybe all three of those concepts are packed into that word depart. But you can see the gain there. And then the other part of it was that he would gain Christ. To depart and to be with Christ, he says, that's far better than this life. And so he was going to win either way. And I think as we bring this to a close, I hate to rush into this part, but just go back up to verse 21 and turn it into a test for yourself. And I think that'll help you know if you're able to advance the gospel where you are at. What would you say in this fill-in-the-blank phrase? For me to live is blank and to die is blank. What would you say? For me to live is all there is and to die is a total loss. For me to live is a disgrace and to die is the end of a miserable life. For me to live is my only hope and to die is utter terror. Or for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. Of course, you know the goal that we ought to have in our faith. Paul sets the bar high, but you can see how those tools helped him advance the gospel. We'll continue talking about his imprisonment, finish up chapter 1 next week. That's the plan anyway.